I first noticed the zonular weakness when I used my Utrata. As I'm pushing down in the anterior capsule, I couldn't grab it, and there's a ton of wrinkling of the capsule. So rather than continuing to loosen the zonules more, I went in with the cystotome. And even with the cystotome, you can notice just more depression and movement of the lens and the peripheral capsules being pulled as I go. It was difficult to pierce because there was weakness, and the capsule would dimple in significantly as I pushed. I started more central, and my plan was to make a slightly smaller capsulotomy, hoping to leave a shelf if I needed it later in the case. I wasn't expecting this lens to be as dense as it was, as we'll see later. As I come back in with the Utrata, it's a little more difficult as I'm pulling. It tended to be smaller than usual, so I had to manually make the capsulotomy larger by exaggerating my moves, more peripheral, to get the size that I desired. So if you just go on muscle memory, you'll end up with a much smaller capsulotomy in these cases because there's a lot of give in the capsule without countertraction as you're pulling and ripping. You can see the peripheral capsule is moving as I pull the capsule gently. This is a slow motion with my Utrata forceps. Again, I'm pushing down on the anterior capsule. There's much more wrinkling than usual. And even when I'm pushing down, the lens is starting to move. Here I try to take a more aggressive pinch and pull move. And as you watch to the right, you can even see the edge of the lens possibly. And a lot of the capsule is shifting with the pull. So I decided not to weaken more zonules. During the hydrodissection, I went out of my way to make sure I didn't pop the cataract out of the bag. If there was more than 3 clock hours of zonular dehiscence, I didn't want to have the lens end deal with vitreous at the same time. So I was using the cataract to keep the shape of the bag intact so I can strategically break it into pieces and remove it. As I'm grooving, I start to recognize that the nucleus will chatter and have much more movement than usual. You'll see during sculpting, I'm going out of my way to make sure I have enough ultrasound so I'm not pushing on the cataract itself. So a lot of times we'll test the zonules in routine cases by actually pushing the phaco tip into nucleus and then increasing the phaco. In this case, I'd rather use more phaco and less movement of the lens, again, keeping the zonules intact. I'm starting proximal with a deep angle and then coming across. At this point, I start to realize that the lens is denser than I had anticipated, and so I'm going to, in a moment, increase the phaco power so I don't have to push on the lens as much to remove material. I'm carefully sculpting, and I'm trying to make a more aggressive than usual and deeper and more peripheral groove. So this is where I added Phaco power. So the top green button on the left, I had 0 traditional longitudinal Phaco, and now I've added I added 10 to the power there. You'll see I have much more chatter as I'm removing lens, but I'm not pushing the lens. I also increased the torsional Phaco by 20 points as well. I decided I'm going to create 4 quadrants with grooves. I'm very careful to have 2 instruments, and notice I'm not pushing on the cataract to rotate it. I'm using the 2 instruments to put no stress or very minimal stress on the bag itself as I rotate it. So I'm balancing the instruments to spin it, not push it with torsional motion. So to best divide the distal hemi into a quadrant, you notice I started proximal so I can get deeper as I approach that quadrant to create a potential space. So here the Phaco is sculpting into this quadrant, and I'm going to go deeper and more peripheral than typical so I can crack with less force and less stress on the bag. I always take an opportunity to sculpt deep and safer in the proximal quadrant as well. Again, notice the rotation. I'm focusing on balancing it and rotating it with minimal stress on the bag itself. I'm going to continue to sculpt each section of my plus sign. So distal is the easiest to view and sculpt. So I'm going to sculpt starting proximal and flat across the middle and going deeper and more peripheral. The reason I wanted to create 4 quadrants was so once I removed that first piece, I was concerned that the bag might start to collapse. So I wanted to have the stage set that I could have the pieces necessary. In fact, I'm going to crack the lens in half, and I'm only going to then crack that half into quadrants, leaving the second half intact. So as you saw, I went into each of the 4 sections of the groove to create them deep and distal. Now as I start my crack, I'm as distal as possible, and I'm attempting to not put a lot of pressure on the bag, although I did require more than I thought to get a crack. And now once I've started distal, I'll come proximal, and it's a little easier to crack this way. So I now have my 2 halves. I'm looking in between my 2 halves to see how thick my plate is. It's tempting to want to just quickly rotate it with a single instrument, but again, I'm going to keep it where I'm using both instruments to balance it as I rotate. It's a little more difficult now that the lens is cracked, so you can see I'm struggling a little to not put pressure on the zonules. You can see the lens kind of shimmering because of the weak zonules. I was able to then crack this half into 2 quadrants. I'm watching how it cracked, and I noticed the piece to the left had less of the groove in the crack. So I'm going to go after that piece first. Notice as I pull, I'm watching the bag, making sure I put as little pressure on that as possible. So I'm pushing on the other lens as counter traction to keep the bag still as I pull this into the iris plane area. I've also now switched from my traditional quadrant setting to a higher Phaco setting, which is called Custom 1. So I still have some traditional Phaco and increased torsional Phaco for ease of removal of these pieces. I'm using the second instrument to keep the other 3 quadrants in the bag and not let the bag move as I remove that single quadrant. I want to avoid trying to rotate the lens and put pressure on the bag, so I'm going to grab it with my phaco tip, and you'll see me use my second instrument to create a space for this to come into the iris plane. And because it's larger than I expected, I'm now chopping this piece with my second instrument at the iris plane and not within the bag. Again, my whole goal is to watch the bag and make sure I'm not putting unnecessary force as I pull these pieces into my tip. And you also notice my phaco tip does not really leave the central 2 millimeters, so it's in a safe area and I can watch it at all times. I'm not reaching for any quadrants or pieces. Using the more aggressive setting of custom 1, that I have higher phaco settings to remove the pieces more easily. Now I'm left with this hemi lens material with a nice groove still in it. I'm careful to use 2 instruments to dial this in the bag. I'm also noticing that to the left I have better zonule support as I'm rotating, that things tend to have a problem in the top right corner with the zonules. I'm then going to mostly crack this hemi. It's a little harder because the other pieces aren't keeping the bag form, so there's a little more give in the bag. I just thought it was cracked enough that I could pull this piece up to the iris plane for safe removal. Some things to consider is having a good knowledge of the phaco machine. I was able to, on the fly, adjust the settings to allow me to better sculpt without pushing on the lens and compromising the zonules. Another consideration is during rotation, I was using 2 instruments to balance the rotation and not put pressure on the zonules. It's a key move when I took the first quadrant out especially, that I was pushing on the other pieces to free the plates up and easily pull that quadrant out of the bag, knowing that it had less epinuclear material because of the way the groove cracked, and then also pushing on other pieces to remove it at the iris plane. For INA removal, I'm going to avoid the section of concern that I believe the zonules are weakest, which is the top right area. I'm also placing a second instrument in just as some counter traction in case the equator of the bag starts to come as I pull cortical material. You'll also notice that I'll engage the INA tip in cortex, and I'll very, very slowly increase my vacuum and slowly peeling and pulling the cortical material off of the capsular bag. The whole time I'm really just watching the capsule to make sure the capsular bag isn't coming with this cortical material. I'm also going to switch now to have an angled tip because it'll be less torquing and pulling and give me more control as I pull pieces. So I'm gently engaging the INA port with cortical material, slowly building vacuum, but trying to peel as slowly and watching for any evidence of additional zonular dehiscence. I enlarged my primary incision, and I decided to place a 3-piece lens in case there was some challenges during insertion. You'll notice that I have to rotate far to the right to get that haptic to stay flat during insertion with the 3-piece lenses, and as I deliver the optic, I'm rotating 180 degrees the other way to keep that haptic flat. Often I'll use a Sinskey hook to deliver the second haptic, but I was concerned about putting more pressure on the lens itself, so I'm going to use an angled McPherson or a Sheets forceps to help me deliver the second haptic with minimal stress. You also note that when you use this instrument, you have to grab it at the right spot on the haptic to allow it for easy delivery. So if I grab it too distal on the haptic, it can be difficult, and if it's too short it won't. So this is just right so I can get that haptic to really place in the capsular bag. I also decided to use a 3-piece lens in case this capsular bag over the years has more dislocation. We would be able to more easily sew the 3-piece to the iris than having to remove it and replace it. I feel lucky to have completed this case and have a centered IOL at the end. I think I contributed to the luck by tiptoeing through each step and utilizing some techniques and understanding the Phaco machine to create success. I hope you learned a few things along the way and look forward to sharing some more videos over time.